Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about media and gender. I've got two articles for you that I thought were interesting because they offer slightly different perspectives on the question of how media and gender interact today. They're a little bit more recent than some of the other ones I've been able to get. And so let's just start with Seen to be Heard by Peddlety and Quaker. And this is a really interesting article because I think it's one of those things that alerts us to issues that we don't necessarily always talk about and that we're not always necessarily aware of because they sort of tend to fly right under our consciousness in terms of what's going on around us in the media world. And so this article is about voiceovers. It's about it's a research analysis of the representations of gender in television commercial voiceovers. And that's going to sound, I think initially that's kind of, it sounds a little frivolous. You're like, well, I don't understand why we're talking about something that's so minor or such a small and specific part of the media landscape. But I think once we get into this a little bit and we start talking about why the results are important, then it'll become a little bit clearer why I chose this particular article and why I think it's an important issue. So they just start off by pointing out that men perform 80% of ad voiceovers, 80%. And when you think about the fact that women are slightly more than half the population of the United States, that's a pretty significant misrepresentation of gender in terms of just the voices that you hear on commercials. And the sad part about this is that in 1975, the number was 90%. In 1975, 40 years ago, the number was 90% of ad voiceovers were men. And so you're like, well, that's good because 80% is an improvement. Over 40 years, though, you'd think that we'd have more of an improvement than a 10% reduction overall. So it's not just that it's 80% of ad voiceovers, it's that number is, for all intents and purposes, substantially unchanged in the last 40 years. It's one of those areas of media that just has not responded to growth and change in terms of what we think of ourselves as a culture and in terms of the sort of like gender diversity that we think that we have as a culture. So male voices, if the authors note, dominate almost all vocal role categories. So it pretty much doesn't matter what kind of role the narrator is taking in a commercial advertisement. That role, regardless of how you break it down into subcategories, is almost always given to a man. Right, and so what's interesting about this, though, and to me the part of their results that are really different and that I hadn't thought about and read before I read this article, is that if you compare just voiceovers where the narrator is not being seen, to voiceovers where the narrator is on screen speaking, in other words, you can see them, then instead of it being 80% of ad voiceovers, you're talking about 60% of ad voiceovers, or 65% of ad voiceovers, that the male dominance is cut in half for role categories featuring the speaker's body. When the speaker is physically visualized on the screen, then a lot more women get those roles. Now, it's still being dominated by men, but instead of it being 80-20, you're talking about 60-40. Right? So that's the interesting part, and the authors have some interesting things to say about that particular outcome. Right? Just to be clear about this, the chances of a woman's voice being heard are greatly increased if her body is also on display. And I think this makes a ton of sense if you think about it, just in terms of how we tend to value women as a culture. If women are not seen, then it seems to us as a culture we have a tendency towards not valuing them. But we tend to value women a lot more when they are physically on display. And obviously there's a lot of problems with that. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But that's what we're talking about in terms of the big sort of takeaway from this. If you've been paying attention to ad voiceovers, and honestly, most of us haven't been. But if you're anyone in that industry, then you know that men are dominating that industry and have been dominating it for a really long time. What you may not have realized is that you've got women having a lot more opportunity, but only if they're visualized, only if you can see their body. So the authors refer to this using a very interesting term. It's scopocentric sexism, right? Which simply means the tendency for visual role presence to influence inordinately when and how a woman's voice will be heard. In other words, it simply means that it's much more likely for a woman to have her voice be able to be heard if she is also displayed visually. And I sort of like scopocentric sexism. It kind of makes sense to me as a term, right? Like scopocentric, like a scope that you're looking through, which means to indicate that the aspect of sight, of visualizing someone, is overrepresented or particularly important in that particular instance. That's why they use the word scopocentric. If we understand the contexts and causes of gender inequity in advertising and other media, the authors believe, then some things happen, right? There's a reason why they think this sort of research is interesting, and I think it's in this part of the article that you begin to understand why I think this is an important issue, right? And because honestly, there's probably 1,000 different little slices of media that we could take a look at in terms of doing research about gender, and the question is, well, why do you look at this slice as opposed to any other slice? So their argument is that it's important for us to understand the contexts and causes of gender inequity in advertising and other kinds of media, and there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, if we understand those causes, then we might be able to redress them, which means we might be able to fix the problem of sexism in media, or at least reduce the problem of sexism in media, if we understood why it was happening. And that just makes all kinds of sense. That's basic, sort of basic logical common sense. If you don't understand why something's happening, it's really difficult to stop it or to change it, right? Whereas if you do understand it, and you understand not only the cause, but as they put it, the sort of like context within which things happen, then it's much easier for us to change things. Also, we can challenge gender biases that otherwise remain unclear and therefore naturalized. And that's a really important idea within gender studies and other kinds of studies, but gender studies in particular, that the sort of biases that we have about gender often are not vocalized, right? They're just not spoken out loud. And because we never talk about them, they seem natural. They seem like the sorts of things that you would expect to happen or that are inevitable, right? And you see a lot of naturalizing of sexism when you see somebody doing something really sexist or saying something really sexist, and people say, oh, well, that's just the way the world is. It's a way of naturalizing it, making it seem inevitable, right? And so the authors believe that if we just understood this better, that one of the reasons why we need this kind of research is so that we can understand this stuff and we can challenge it, that we can vocalize it. We can say, here are the biases that we are dealing with, and as a result of that, we can speak it out loud, and we can get it out into an open space where we can actually discuss it and challenge those kinds of biases. So, they start out by saying, and I think this is hardly controversial given the numbers we've been talking about, that advertisers seem to have strong biases in favor of male voiceovers. In other words, the reason that 80% of ad voiceovers are men is not an accident, right? It is a purposeful pattern of bias, and it's not just not an accident, and it's not just purposeful. It's aware and intentional, right? It's not something where advertisers go, oh my God, I didn't realize that we were hiring mostly men. It's something they're doing because they believe it's the right thing to do. Right, so when we talk about bringing biases out into the public or out into the open where we can challenge them, there's this bias that exists in advertising towards male voices, right? And so advertisers seem to believe that male voices are perceived as more authoritative, right? And that's an important thing to understand. When the researchers go in and they're talking to advertisers, they're getting this response that the reason that advertisers tend to choose male voices is that they believe the audience is perceiving those voices as full of authority, right? And there's a couple of interesting aspects of that they get into, right? So, first of all, it's unclear this is true. It is unclear that people actually see male voices as more authoritative, that general belief that you have amongst advertisers is even actually correct. It's simply sort of a gut feeling amongst people, and the research on this is very divided. So they go into this point just a little bit more about what do we really know about how people respond to different vocal genders, right? They say a lot of studies show that there's actually no difference based on gender, that if you ask people, if you study carefully how people really respond to male voices versus female voices, there's a number of studies that indicate that people don't actually see male voices as more authoritative. And if you think about just the course of your life, there's a whole long slew of instances where in most of our lives, we do have a lot of women in our lives who are authorities, right? Our parents, our relatives, our teachers in many instances. A lot of women are in positions of authority over us, regardless of who we are. And so the notion that we would always see men as more authoritative just doesn't kind of make sense given our lived experience, right? So their first position is simply that if there's a lot of studies that don't support this notion at all, but when there are studies that do show a difference in how we perceive these voices, the very important argument that they make is that if you look at that research carefully, if you look at the research that does seem to show that we perceive men as more authoritative, that's not necessarily a good thing for the way the audience responds to male voices, and it's not necessarily a bad thing for the way that the audience responds to female voices. In other words, what the authors are trying to say is that the notion that advertisers have that we respond to male voices as being more authoritative, that we perceive them in that fashion. The authors say that advertisers not only have a bias towards this idea, this connection that we have between hearing a male voice and perceiving authority, but also the notion that we perceive authority positively. Right? The question that the researchers have is, okay, if it's true that the audience does in fact see male voices as more authoritative, is that good? Right? Because the point of an ad is to sell you something. Is the best way to sell something always authority? Or are there other kinds of reactions that you might be looking for from the audience that are better served by a female voice that does not necessarily trigger a perception of authority? That there are a lot of instances in which what you want from the audience is not a reaction of, oh, I'm hearing an authoritative voice, but I'm hearing some other form of voice, right? So there's a dual bias going on here. One is just the belief, generally speaking, that male voices are interpreted as authoritative, which is not clear at all. But even if that were the case, there's a second bias towards the notion that authority is the right way to sell things. And that's another instance where we're just not sure that they're right. So, female voices are, for example, often seen as more soothing when we look at this research where there's a bias, and not all research shows a bias, but when we do find studies that show a bias in terms of how we interpret male and female voices, we often see female voices in those studies. People will say that they see a female voice as more soothing. And there are plenty of instances in which a soothing voice is exactly what you want as an advertiser in terms of achieving the desired outcome. Right? It's not necessarily true that authoritative voices are always necessarily the best voices. So advertisers, that we find out when we really do research on advertisers, we find out that they're sort of hedging their bets on this assumption that the audience likes male voices better and that the audience likes authoritative voices better. And when I say they're hedging their bets, what the authors are talking about is that advertisers don't have a ton of conclusive evidence on this one way or the other. P.S. We don't actually see a lot of advertisers looking for that kind of evidence. They're just reacting on what they've been told and on the sort of stereotypical traditions of that particular industry. And so they're like, look, I'm not positive, but let me just go ahead and play it safe by using male voices. Right? So the authors are then asking themselves, why is it true that audience prefer male to female voices, if that is the case? And by the way, again, the research is not conclusive about this, but if we were to let's just say that we grant the argument that a lot of advertisers make that the audience does prefer a male voice to a female voice. The question then is, why is that the case? And that's an important question for anyone that wants to do research on this kind of gender differential, right? So the point the authors make is that the lack of female voiceovers in commercials might actually be a cause of our preference for male over female voices, right? It's the reason that we prefer male to female voices, assuming that we do in the instances where we do, one of the reasons that's true might be because we hear more male voices in ad voiceovers than we do female voices. So children, the authors point out, are raised in a media environment where there are very few female voices. And this isn't just true based on the research that I'm talking about here for advertising voiceovers. If you look across the research about the way the media is composed, you will find that most of the voices, period, whether it's a drama or a documentary or news or whatever it is, most of the voices, period, are male. Most of the characters on television, for example, are male. It's a substantial misrepresentation. And so if children are growing up in an environment where they just don't hear women's voices in the media, which is what the authors contend, especially in the area of commercial voiceovers, then that might be a reason why we grow up with this bias, which is kind of the result of a preference based on our experience, right? If we've grown up hearing one thing, then we tend to just expect that. When we imagine in our head what a commercial voiceover sounds like, we imagine a male voice as the default voice, because that is what we've been exposed to. That has been our experience based on a pre-existing bias. So in many ways, the bias is self-sustaining, right? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. To say we ought to have male voices instead of female voices because that's what the audience prefer is to create another generation of people who prefer male voices over female voices, right? So advertisers even just make this phenomenon worse because executives tend to give advice to other advertising executives that reinforces this sort of stereotype. Here's what I'm talking about. Some executives think that the best thing is for men to be seen as acting and women should only appear and not speak. They'll say men act, women appear. Right? And that maxim, that sort of notion that we ought to run our advertising, that we ought to represent advertising images in such a way where men are doing stuff and women are just sitting there, is to make this existing preference for male voices worse, right? And I guess the last thing I want to say about this is that when we talk about women only being seen, only being heard when they're seen, that's an example of this. That women sort of have to pay the price of displaying their bodies in order to get to be heard. And that is almost a classic, that is one of the most classic definitions of a sort of sexist mentality that you can think of, that women only get to speak when they're putting themselves on display. Whereas men get to speak in every instance and in a lot of instances where they don't appear at all. And that sort of voice from nowhere is a very powerful position. And when we intentionally only let men occupy that position, not only are we enacting sexism, but we're sort of teaching the next generation of kids that that is what they should expect. All right, second article is called From Damsels in Distress to Sexy Superheroes by Summers and Miller, which is kind of awesome, and it, as a title in general, and it goes to a very interesting question about how we do stuff in the media. We talked about video games already, but they're talking about something very specific within video games. They've done this sort of longitudinal study of video game representation. So they're talking about how in early video games, most of the women that were pictured were shown as damsels in distress. In other words, if there was a female in a video game, she was there to be rescued. She was there because she was in need of rescue. And this goes back as far as you can really find, human characters in video games. That's the classic, Mario's trying to save the princess. Every video game that you can think of from those early eras were trying to rescue the girl. Donkey Kong is that way. There's all kinds of instances where the only female character is a character who is in distress and in need of rescue. So women in video games existed to be rescued by the male characters. That was their purpose. The authors note that especially younger video game players risk seeing gender roles in games as models for their life, right? That's the concern about video games, is that they're more involved. We play a part in the video games, and if we're showing a lot of young kids over and over the exact same representation of gender relations, which is that women are in need of rescue and men do the rescuing, then we run the risk of teaching children that that is the way that we should see the world, not just video games, right? And it's that sort of subtle lesson that I think is honestly much more dangerous than the belief that we talked about before, that playing a video game makes you violent. That's a really blunt kind of assessment of causality. Whereas I think there's a much better argument for these sort of nuanced educational outcomes of video games, that they just teach us that this is what the world is like, in much the same way that television does when we talked about the cultivation effect of television, right? That slowly over time you begin to believe subtly that the world in television is an accurate representation of the real world. Same things going on in video games. At least that is what we are concerned about when it comes to this kind of depiction of women. So regardless of age, studies indicate that video game representations may affect our perceptions of real people when it comes to gender. In other words, when we see people in video games, we don't see them as real in terms of their actions in the game, right? We know that, like, you can't really jump over fire pits the way Mario does, and you can't really even accomplish all the amazing things that RPG characters do or first-person shooter characters do in video games, but we begin to believe that the more subtle aspects of the plot are more real, and those subtle aspects tend to include gender relationships. So we seem to say, the video games, and especially lots of RPGs and first-person shooters, play out narratives in front of us, and those narratives tend to be very similar in terms of how they depict gender relations. So we've got some studies that indicate that when we play these video games, we begin to slowly but tentatively, but over time, very strongly adopt their view of how the world works, specifically when it comes to gender representations. In video games, existing research suggests that female characters are highly sexualized. If you've ever played a video game, you can't really be surprised by this, right? This includes depictions of women as sex objects, and it also includes depictions of women as sexual aggressors, right? So even when women are pictured as people who have agency in sex, you just don't see female characters that aren't sexualized, right? That all female characters must be sexualized. And there's a ton of male characters who aren't sexualized in any way in video games. And if they are sexualized, it's only because there happens to be a woman present. Whereas women are almost always sexualized. They're almost always depicted according to sexual desire. And you just don't see women characters that walk through life without this stuff going on. Right, so that is a particular problem, that women are seen to only and exclusively be associated with sex, and are only allowed to have agency within the realm of sex, that they don't have agency in other ways. So the authors are testing whether depictions of women in video games have changed over time, right? And they're doing that in two different categories. They're looking at benevolent sexism, and benevolent sexism is just the idea that more traditional attitudes towards women, particularly paternalistic, protective attitudes towards women, are good. Right? The benevolent sexism is, oh yes, we treat men and women differently, but it's because we value women and we want to protect them, right? So saving the female character from the monster is an example of benevolent sexism, but it's also very paternalistic. And all of those instances, or almost all of those instances, the woman in question can't seem to do anything for herself. And is always in need of a male character to make anything in her life happen. So there's benevolent sexism, which is not necessarily like outright hostile to women, but it's still a negative attitude towards women, and it's still a sexist attitude towards women. The other category they look at is hostile sexism, and that endorses attitudes and behaviors that exploit women as sexual objects through the expression of derogatory characteristics of women. In other words, it's demeaning and degrading to women, and it sees women only as sexual objects. And there's a bunch of examples of this throughout the course of all video game history, and certainly in modern video games as well, where you see depictions of women exclusively as sexual objects, depictions of women as negative in all ways, and simply as not on par in terms of their humanity with the male characters in the game. So they want to see whether these two things have changed over time. So here's what they came up with. Here's what their research concluded. First of all, it looks like women are a lot less likely to be depicted as needing rescue. That's a trope that's kind of been worn out, and you don't see that as much anymore. It still happens, but it's much less likely than it was in the early days of video games. Women are now often also the heroes of games. Now, one of the things they don't talk about in this research that I really wish they would, there's a ton of video games now that allow you to choose a bunch of things about your character, right down to the way your character looks. But one of the most common of these kinds of choices that you are offered in modern video games is that you are offered the choice between being male or female. And I'm particularly interested in that, because as someone that's interested in this issue, when I play video games, I tend to choose to be female because I want to see how the game reacts to that choice, right? I want to see if it makes a difference. And it's shocking how many games in which it doesn't make a difference, and not in a good way, right? There are a bunch of games where if you choose to be a woman, in the cutscenes you're still a man. Or when you choose to be a woman, the game reacts to you in precisely the same way, as though that choice has no impact at all on your life and existence. And there's whole aspects of the plot that make no sense if the main character is a woman. So I really wish they had engaged in this, and they don't. But they do say that there's a bunch of instances in which the hero is female, right? So that's a change that we've had from the past. However, When the hero is female, you still see lots of very sexualized portrayal of those heroes, right? Lara Croft's a good example of this. They're portrayed as sexual objects. They're portrayed as highly sexualized. It is almost impossible to find a video game in which there is a prominent female character who's human who is not sexualized in some way, in which if the main character is female, then for some reason that has to mean sex. When the main character is male, a bunch of the time it doesn't. A bunch of the time they're just killing stuff. And you'll almost never see sex involved at all with men in terms of how we depict their personalities. But women, every single time, pretty much. There's still a lot of problematic elements in video games when it comes to gender. So we haven't really necessarily, we've changed some things, and that's really good. It's possible to find, female protagonists in video games, but there's a lot of stuff that hasn't changed. And that's really what they want to talk about. And that's it.